Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. The Orange Man is now eyeing Greenland, and his consigliere, Stephen Miller, as well as that shrew he calls his wife, is saying that Greenland ought to be part of the United States. You know, up until 3 months ago, these clowns couldn't even find Greenland on a map. Now, the white media's take on this is basically that by Trump talking all of this hostility toward Greenland, that somehow this is going to be a threat to NATO. But truth be told, is it really a threat to NATO or a threat to white solidarity that they truly fear? After all, who the world wants anything from Greenland or Europe for that matter? Dr. John Henrik Clarke rightly called Europe a thawed-out icebox, and Greenland is the prototypical barren wasteland. Trump's raison d'etre for this is to blame China. It's always time to blame China for everything, especially when he wants to do something outrageous. China doesn't have an interest in Greenland territorially, though they do have an interest politically. But the fact that China wants a presence there at all, that's why the neocons are all hot and bothered about it. At least that's what they say. But the reality is this is a global game of chess, and if you can establish a presence in one place, that basically denies it to the other guy. And yet you got some Negroes who are saying that this is a problem. Agreed, but as Dr. John Henrik Clarke also said, for who and for what? All those white folks in Europe are getting nervous. This will be the end of NATO, they say, and that's an enormous threat to the United States, but apparently it can't be too threatening, because even with this threat looming, you don't see any Democrats or moderates making it a point to prioritize it, now do you? None of them are saying that this is going to be something that makes or breaks the midterm elections, or makes or breaks the American presidency. Instead, it's on the back burner. Even with all that's happening, none of them is coming to the black community and saying, look, NATO is about to go down in flames, totalitarianism is about to take over the entire nation and then the world, we'll do whatever you want. After all, nothing you Negroes want could possibly be worse than what Trump is already doing. I mean, that's what you would think if the threat is real, right? The same way that they made it a point to ignore our demands during the election, they're still doing so now. They think that at least for right now, they can make it through the 2026 midterms because the number of congressional seats they need to take are spread out across districts where the black vote won't be able to concentrate enough to make a difference. Sure, black voters can make a difference in some of those districts, but as Democrats see it, they have a roadmap to a congressional majority even without large-scale black support. That's the game that they're playing. The Republicans are not the enemy they're trying to beat. The enemy they want to defeat is black people. Black empowerment is the big threat, not the Orange Man. And since clearly they're not very worried at the prospect of NATO crumbling, I'm not either. We're not going to let these guys go into phony hysterics and then we suddenly start getting scared too. That's not the way empowerment works. What they're worried about is something else. And it's something that I think is a good thing. We're seeing the white powers that be having the mask of phony solidarity ripped off. All of their pretend camaraderie is being laid bare for the farce it's always been. The world is seeing what these guys have always been about. The talk about democratic elections in Venezuela is starting to sound pretty hollow now that the same cast of characters is saying it about Greenland. Now all of a sudden the same people who are saying, well, we don't like how Trump changed things in Venezuela, but we agree with the fact that he did it. Now that he's saying he's going to do the same thing in Greenland, all of a sudden it's a huge problem. What does that tell you? And interestingly, all of those Republicans who couldn't wait to jump on board the bandwagon of get rid of Maduro, now all of a sudden these guys are being quiet too. All of a sudden they have nothing to say. Why is that? Is Greenland running drug boats to the U.S.? Is Greenland a hotbed of cooperation with radical extremists like Iran and the Palestinians? Are any of Greenland's elections being questioned? Do they think that the president or prime minister over there didn't get elected fairly? Are even one of the weak claims that was made about Venezuela being applied here? Of course not. That shows that regime change is never about what they say it is. Russia has a bunch of oil. So why doesn't anyone ever decide that they're going to threaten Russia with military takeover? Because Russia also has a nuclear arsenal too. That's why. They don't go and pick on people who actually have enough force to fight them. They always go looking for somebody smaller and weaker to go after. And that's not just because of military assessments or because of realpolitik. The reason that they keep going after some targets and not after others is an expression of philosophy on their part. Same way that whenever they try to lynch a black person or the thugs in blue kill someone in an ambush murder, they always make sure that there's more of them than there are of the other person. That's because the white supremacist is a bully, and like all bullies, they're cowards. Dr. John Henrik Clarke called that devious penchant of theirs the evil genius of Europe. But the white supremacists' biggest mistake is that they keep overestimating their evil genius. They always do. They never show compassion or even common courtesy to one another in Europe. They normalized ethnic hostility towards one another there. And most of all, they made it normal to lie, constantly, nonstop, especially to themselves. Is this really all about checkmating China? That's part of it, to be sure. And no matter what the white media may tell you, there's a reason why so many countries are turning to China. They're looking for an alternative to what the United States has been doing. They're looking for somebody else that they can go to precisely because of behavior like this. China is rising in the world, but they didn't do it the same way that these white supremacists did. That doesn't mean that China's the good guys. But what it does mean is China's doing the one thing the white supremacy was created to prevent. And that is competing. They've created their own separate center of power, and that center of power is taking on its own gravity, and it's getting stronger. So, what is a white supremacist to do? Well, what you do is you try to go ahead and get a foot and a hand in as many corners of the world as possible. If you can't stop China from growing, at least you try to put limits on where it can grow into. White supremacy was born into its own grave. What the Europeans try to call the Age of Exploration was actually the Age of Exodus. They were getting the hell out of Europe. Look at what life, quote-unquote, in Europe was like prior to 1492. They had wars, famines, diseases nonstop, crooked, brutal regimes, a bunch of warlords. Those are the guys who need to be overthrown. And yet the Europeans, rather than stay in Europe and solve their problems, what did they do? They said, let's go ahead and get the hell out of here. Europe had an abundance of poor, broke criminals, so it appealed to the not-so-noble noblemen to go ahead and get these guys out of there too. At least send them somewhere else so you ain't got to see them and ain't got to smell them. So that's what Europe was doing prior to 1492. And everything that they've done ever since that date has been all about trying to keep themselves on life support ever since. Europe attempting to keep itself out of its own grave a little bit longer by exploiting black people in Africa and in the Americas. That's what this whole mad scheme has been about. And they're terrified that sooner or later somebody's going to come along and pull the plug. Or at the very least, they will occasionally disrupt the flow of power. That's what this is really about. Does the orange man have ulterior motives in addition to this? Of course he does. As spoiled as he is, and as crooked as he is, and as many scandals as he's got, and as surrounded by incompetence as he is, there could be anything else going on here, and you would be right about it. People are scared of China, quote-unquote, taking Greenland. But China's not the ones telling the world that they're determined to get it by hook or by crook, nor are they intimating that they'll send in their military either. It's Trump and the Americans who are doing it. And you know that both parties are on board with it by how muted their objections have been. None of them have been saying, as soon as we get power back, first order of business is we're going to impeach him just for merely talking about this. He's threatening NATO. After all it took was Trump simply saying, maybe I won't send weapons to Ukraine, and that's what triggered the first impeachment against him. The fact that he's threatening a NATO partner to the point that you got Europeans saying, maybe we need to send in some of our guys to protect Greenland, that ought to have people in D.C. climbing the walls. But it doesn't. If this is Trump blustering in order to try to discourage the Chinese from having any designs on Greenland, that is possible. But the question becomes what happens when the Chinese look and go, well, you know what? It doesn't look like the Americans are actually doing anything. It's probably just a bunch of hot air. The Chinese are not trying to take over Greenland militarily. That would be too much, and even the people in Greenland wouldn't stand for it. But as far as their economic and political influence goes, which is the main weapon that China's been using, now that is a threat. The Chinese have mastered the art of soft power, but that becomes a lot easier when you got the Americans being a bunch of hard heads. But the same way that I told you to keep an eye on what the Houthis have been doing and how Joe Biden was attacking them and how I told you that that was going to take on increased significance over the years, I would tell you the exact same thing about this, not just about Greenland, but about the stress fractures and the pathetic facade of white solidarity that are now being exposed. Because that's the truly interesting thing here. Whenever these white supremacists feel like they're on a winning streak, they feel like they're on a roll, all of a sudden they start letting their mouths get a little bit loose, and they also start wanting to throw their weight around. For them, that happens to be a compulsion they simply cannot control. And why should they? There's no honor among thieves. These guys are the exact same gang of cutthroats and scumbags that their ancestors were 500 years ago. All of the stuff that they put in their TV and movies trying to show themselves as being so refined and sophisticated, even they know that's a pack of lies. These guys are evil incorporated. Always have been. Everything else has just been propaganda, psychological warfare to try to convince you that you're not dealing with pure evil even though you are. And unfortunately, they've been largely successful with this. Typically, things like what Trump is doing, all of this scampering and fighting amongst white power, is usually done behind closed doors. And this is how white power has maintained the paper-thin illusion of a united front against the non-white, read black world. And that's been one of the main things that makes it where a lot of black folks, even those who should know better, they look at white power and they think to themselves, well, these guys, they're so united, you see. They have absolutely no gaps in their armor whatsoever. There's absolutely no breaks in their wall that can be exploited. When the reality is, white power made sure to keep black folks poor precisely because you won't have the resources to take advantage of those gaps and exploitations that are there. When you have the most ravenous thieves in the world who have slaughtered and stolen in every corner of the planet they've gone, well, it's only a matter of time before cracks form in that wall and they become public. What Trump has been doing towards Greenland is just another reminder that what white supremacy has convinced the world is its solidarity has actually been when you got the guy who's got the most might and is the most violent, the most willing to kill people, that's the one who tells everybody else you got to get in line. And that's part of the reason why they scamper and scramble so much to get their hands on as many resources as possible. You could never have had the post-World War II quote-unquote order that the United States was able to establish without the United States having massive resources ahead of time. What the United States is doing regarding China is indeed a game of global chess. And the entire purpose of chess is to teach people how to think 5 and 10 and 12 moves ahead. That's what the Orange Man is doing, as obnoxious and clumsy as his efforts are. And please don't let the kvetching and the occasional tongue clicking by the Democrats fool you. White supremacy has always believed in taking both sides of the conversation. Try to go ahead and talk altruistic, but at the end of the day, you will support whatever you think is in the interest of your power. And Trump may not be the nicest tool for that, but as blunt a tool as he's been, when it comes to elbowing his way into the proceedings, that's exactly what white power wants the world to see. That these guys are going to be showing up, and what they'll do is they'll tell you one time, hey, we're interested in this, and if you don't immediately hand it over, then out comes the gun. Look, stop trying to see which white supremacists are going to be nicer. That's not the situation we have here and never have. Both of them are bastards. We've got honest bastards and lying bastards, and by honest what I mean is they don't feel the need to cover up what they think about you. And while the white media is making a big deal about all this, keep in mind, what's of interest and importance to the true audience of the white media, which happens to be established white opinion, that's a very different set of priorities than the ones that black people have. So yeah, they're concerned about NATO fracturing, but not for the reasons that they're telling you. The real game as they see it is to duplicate what happened after the Second World War, which was they throw their weight around, and the Europeans will sit there and say, oh, we can't take this, and then in the end, they roll right over and take it. Dominance has been reasserted, and that kind of primitive hindbrain thinking is exactly what you would expect from Donald Trump and his ilk and his in-laws. After all, what do you expect from a group of folks who are directly descended from Neanderthals? And it's pretty obvious the genes were strong on that one. So let the orange orangutan fling his feces at the Europeans. These guys basically have a mess of their own making. The only difference is playing out publicly. And hopefully this will be something that people actually remember. Sure, they have a very good track record of having these public dust-ups, and then eventually cooler heads prevail and they go behind closed doors. Guys, we can't be fighting publicly like this. But understand, these are the kind of tensions and fractures that are always simmering just beneath the surface. This is the reason why anti-black racism had to be created in the first place. The Europeans and their diaspora were constantly at each other's throats to the point that they wiped out a number of their little ethnic groups. These guys were going to be tearing themselves apart. They desperately needed a distraction. And what better distraction than black people? You see, as the Europeans showed in Ireland, if black people didn't exist, they would have had to make them up. So as far as I'm concerned, let this thing play out. Let it get big and ugly and nasty. Let these guys get to the point where they're screaming at each other in public. Let these guys go ahead and have their little tin can ships on the ocean pointing their guns at one another. People need to understand exactly what white supremacy is about and stop being afraid to ask whether or not these guys can be turned against each other. Just because these guys have an overarching culture of complete disdain for black people does not mean that these guys all love each other. What it means is the enemy hasn't seen enough organization from black people to the point that we can take advantage of these natural fault lines amongst them. The enemy learned a very, very long time ago how crucial appearances are. and that most people, they just look at things and they never actually go much further than that. They don't ask any questions, and they tend not to doubt what they see. They basically accept it at face value. That's something the enemy learned a long time ago, so that's why keeping up appearances is so very, very important and very crucial to them. As long as people see what appears to be iron, rigid solidarity, most of them will look and go, well, obviously these guys are completely and thoroughly united. But the enemy, he knows better. And whenever they decide to put such emphasis on trying to show solidarity, and they do it to the point that it becomes cartoonish, it reminds me of something else that Dr. John Henrik Clarke said. Show me a man's strongest trait, and on the flip side, I'll show you his weakest. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Nathaniel Nelson, Walter Wilborn, Williams, Gavin Andrade, and TJ. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.